There we go.
Okay, so that was a long reading, a long passage, but we're not going to go through it verse by verse. You'll be glad to hear. We're going to take these 3 chapters, Exodus 7:14 to 10:29, and we're going to take them in threes, really. It's the 9 plagues, the first 9 plagues, and so we're going to take them in groups of 3, which Christopher Wright, the commentator, he suggests that these should be read as 3 threes, rather than all disconnected plagues. So just to make it easier for us to work our way through it, I think that is a good way to do things. So the beginning of chapter 7 was the bit we started on last time. So we've got Moses and Aaron have just appeared. They've gone in to see the Pharaoh. Must be quite terrifying for them, but they're feeling quite confident because they showed the signs, remember, 2 or 3 weeks ago, to the Israelite elders, and the Israelite elders were convinced right away. They saw the staff that was turned into a snake. They saw the hand. Moses put his hand in, pulled it out, it was leprous. He put it in again, pulled it out, and the leprosy was gone. We're not told that he poured a cup of water and it became blood, but I think we assume that for the elders of Israel, they would have seen these 3 signs that Moses was given in the wilderness to be the evidence that God was with him, and God was therefore with Israel in Egypt, so that this 400 years of silence that they've had has been broken. God is around again. God has heard the grumbling of his people and come to them. But what the result of doing that, of Moses going and requesting his the freedom of the people to go and to worship God in the wilderness, you remember, was that the Pharaoh said, they've obviously got too much time on their hands, these Israelites. Don't give them straw anymore, so they're going to have to work harder to make their bricks. And so that would have deflated Moses and Aaron, and the people of Israel begin their grumbling, which is a theme we're going to see as we go through the book of Exodus, that the people of Israel grumble all the time. Moses fails a lot. These kind of things keep happening over and over again. And they're just lessons in humanity for us, because we grumble a lot and we fail all the time. And as we read through these things, you can imagine how Moses would have gone from feeling very confident to feeling not so confident. But then he and Aaron go into Pharaoh again, because God calls them to do it, and God wants them to make the claim. Well, the famous phrase is, let my people go. That's what they're asking for. That's what they repeatedly request from the Pharaoh. And we're going to see them again and again and again going into Pharaoh. Now, they don't go to Pharaoh every time there's a plague. That's why Chris Wright says this should be 3 threes, because there are different circumstances with the different plagues. And sometimes they don't even go to Pharaoh. The plague just comes, and the people of Egypt suffer a plague, and then we get a response from each plague from the Pharaoh. But now and again they're told, go into the Pharaoh, trouble the Pharaoh, and that's what frustrates the Egyptians. How many times is this man going to trouble us? Well, as many times as it takes for you to do what God is telling you to do. That's the answer to them. They're trying to get the people to go out to Egypt, and the Pharaoh, he keeps saying no, but sometimes he seems like he's up for a discussion about it, but he always wants it on his terms, not on God's terms. A bit like Donald Trump. So he keeps saying that he's thinking about letting the people go, but maybe just the men. Or he's thinking about letting the people go, but not out of the land, just do the sacrifices in the land. Or he's thinking about the people, letting the people go, and then he simply says, no, I'm not going to do it whenever the plague and the trouble has passed. So we have this repeated behaviour by the Pharaoh, repeated requests from Moses and Aaron, and God sending his men, Moses and Aaron, to the Pharaoh repeatedly to make their requests. And it all begins with this what seems like failure, where Moses is confidently going in front of Pharaoh. They throw the rod on the ground to become a snake, and then Pharaoh's magicians do the same thing. They use their... Now, we don't really believe in magic nowadays, but the Bible's quite open to some kind of miracle, some kind of performance here, even on the side that's not God's side. The miracles don't always prove that God is on your side. We say that about Jesus in the Gospel of John that we studied, that his divinity is what John is at pains to prove to us, and that's why there's so many miracles in the Gospel of John. The fact that that Jesus is God is the thing that John is out to prove. So the miracles that he performed, the wonders that he performed, they show us that Jesus is God. So Moses goes to show that God is with him. And the response of the Pharaoh is to command his magicians. And all of these great leaders, whether it's the Pharaoh, whether it's the ruler of Babylon, the king of Babylon later, and Daniel and so on, they're just as spiritual as the Israelites, even though they don't have the real God on their side. And so they're open to this kind of to this kind of magic or miracle, and they're actually able to perform it. I think we should be quite astonished and taken aback, and as I think Moses would have been when these people who follow a false religion are able to turn the staff. We were amazed at it a few chapters ago when it happened at the burning bush. We thought, wow, this is exciting. God's with Moses and he's giving him these tricks to prove that he's with him. And then we should be astonished when we read Pharaoh's men were able to do the same thing. They turned sticks into snakes somehow. And we need to be open to the idea that spiritual things go on in the world outside of the Christian world and the Christian realm. So, we have that, I'm on the wrong chapter here. We have that performance takes place. We see the trouble is that these guys are able to perform the same thing, but then it leaves us with hope because Aaron and Moses still win because Aaron's snake eats all the other snakes. And so even though there's a problem, I guess, with what we expected Aaron would turn the thing into a snake and Pharaoh would say, oh my goodness, God's with them, you can take the people and let them go. But there's going to be trouble, is the symbolism really that we see when they manage to turn them into snakes. But then when Aaron's dragon is the term used in the text, Aaron's dragon eats them all, so his was a bigger snake. Maybe the word snake, when we read it, maybe it is a dragon rather than a snake, some kind of lizard. It shows us, or the Moses' snake is obviously bigger and better and wins out in the end. But there's going to be this trouble on the way. That's really what we're seeing. It's not going to be simple and straightforward. There's going to be a difficult path to follow. And we all remember the 10 plagues from Sunday school, I'm sure. And everybody out there, at least of a certain generation, I don't know today, I don't know the kids of today if they're looking at the 10 plagues in RE or if they're not. But I think people out, am I right? People our age, old folks like us.
Old Testament
Sunday
school, yes.
we all, it rings a bell, the 10 plagues in Egypt. It's something that's enculturated in us. And we read here about these, that Moses is going to begin, or God is going to begin the plagues. But you remember all the way through, God has said to Moses, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. And we have this mysterious thing going on that we don't really like, but we have to accept that if God is in charge, then when Pharaoh hardens his heart, God's involved in that somehow. God is mysteriously involved, and he knows this is how it's going to be, and he can say from the very beginning, we're going to have all these plagues happen before he lets the people go. These things are going to happen, but Pharaoh will harden his heart, and we're going to have these troubles. And I guess for us, there's a lesson there that going through life, living in a sinful world, we're going to have complicated lives, and God is going to take us to heaven in the end, but there's a lot more to come before the end. There's a lot of ups and downs coming before the end. So the promised land is promised. The promised land, God has appeared after 400 years of silence to take them to the promised land, but there's a lot to come in between. There's a lot more story to come in our lives before we get there. It's not all positive. It's not all blessing in the Christian life. There's difficulties to overcome. I think that's something like that we could say. But we want to see then these three lots of plagues. What do we make of them? What comments can we make? And I'm going to be pretty quick. The reading was long, that's why I said we'll miss out some of the service so that we can, or we'll not have communion so that we can spend some time. But I don't want to spend lots of time on the text, really. I just want to jump through the plagues so that we've got an idea of what happened. And the first one then is the blood. And you remember Moses was told to take a cup at the burning bush and pour the cup of water, and it became blood in the sand. We think he probably did that in front of the elders, but he didn't seem to do that in front of Pharaoh. However, we have the exact same miracle, but on a much larger scale happens as the first plague, because Moses is told to go and lift his rod over the river, and all of the river turned to blood. The Nile turned to blood. All of their pots and pans of water turned to blood. Everything that was water, when they had it there, it all turned to blood. And the lesson, blood speaks about two things through the Bible. It speaks about life and it speaks about death. And this one was death. This is a curse of death over the land of Egypt. And we know that because everything died. The fish died, floated to the top of the river, dead because of the river of blood. It looks like they were able to dig and get more water. I guess there's fresh water rushing through this river from somewhere, but for some time there was this, the whole river turned to blood throughout the land of Egypt. And it's the first miracle of Moses, I think, or the first plague. It's in some sense the first real miracle of Moses. But it also, I think, for the Christian today, reminds us of the first miracle of Jesus, which we looked at in the Gospel of John. Do you remember? You guys went here for that one, but do you remember what it is? It's turning the water into wine.
Yeah.
So the water into wine is Jesus' first miracle. Yeah. Wine, when we have communion, is our symbol of blood. And so Jesus comes along and he brings life and he brings a party to the wedding, because they've ran out of wine. It's a disaster. The groom is supposed to have provided everything for the wedding. It's a real fail if he doesn't have enough wine for days long, maybe even weeks long of a party. And so Jesus comes and provides what he needs, and the comment at the end of the night is, usually people serve the rubbish wine.
It's the best wine. At
the end, you've kept the best wine till the end. And there's this joy and rejoicing, this life-giving idea, and then when wine at the end of the gospel then becomes communion, and so it's life-giving wine. This is my blood, which is poured out for you to give you life from the dead, to give you resurrection. He had to die in order to rise again. But not so with Moses. Moses' first miracle, first sign, first plague here is no water and death, because the Nile, the fish die, and the people have to work to find more water. And we find again that it's easily replicated somehow. Is it the devil? I don't know. I don't know what it is. Is it some kind of, I don't know, energy thing? But the magicians are able to turn water into at least what looks like blood. I don't know if it's real either, or if it's some kind of subliminal effect that's going on. It's very hard to explain, but somehow these magicians are able to replicate this first sign. And that makes us feel, well, maybe that's why the Pharaoh doesn't really listen to this one. He hardens his heart and he says no again, because he's able to get his own magicians somehow to replicate it. I think it takes us back to the burning bush, and the point of that water into blood was to convince the Pharaoh. But then if the Pharaoh can do it himself, or his magicians can do it with a cup of water, it takes away from the miracle. Now, they don't do the whole of Egypt. They don't do the Nile. They don't do everybody's buckets of water. God is able to do things way beyond what these magicians are able to do. But it seems to be enough to convince the Pharaoh this isn't really very serious. It does say that they dig, and when they dig, they're able to find fresh water. And it seems like with all of these miracles or plagues, there's God is merciful. He leaves. Well, we'll get onto it in a minute. But he was it the hail that destroyed the first crop, the earlies, but then the main crop wasn't destroyed, so there was still going to be food if he had listened. So it seems like God always holds back. He doesn't destroy the Egyptians. He's always merciful. He gives favour when it's not deserved. And so they're able to get some fresh water, and it just feels like it's not as serious as it could have been, the river being turned to blood. So Pharaoh doesn't listen. He just hardens his heart. He says, no, we're not going to listen. But imagine living on a river and it turns to blood. Imagine seeing dead fish rising to the top. Imagine how that would have shaken the people. But the stubborn ruler says, no, that one wasn't enough to make me relent. And so then we have almost a comical plague of frogs next. Now, the frogs probably want out of the water because they don't want to die in the river the way the fish did. But it's after that plague we have, and I'm not sure how much time passes. I feel like we read it and it's all one big story, but I feel like for it to have any effect, there must be some time elapsing between one plague and the other. But imagine, again, the frogs are coming out of the water, and even the description of they'll be in your ovens, the frogs. It's very clear and I think meant to be quite comical. Jack, when we were in where were we? Kintyre last year. We went for a walk around a loch that's got beavers in it, but he wasn't interested in looking for beavers because he spotted a frog, and then he spotted another, and he carried this frog all the way around the loch, and then he found another one, so he had two, and I think he had a third one by the time we were almost all the way around, but we had to convince him to let them go free. But he was worried they were going to be disoriented and we should be going back to where we got them.
There's a funny Gerald Durrell there. Yeah.
So it's very it's very comical to think about it or to picture it all. But it would have been fearful for the people. It would have been a terrifying thing that these frogs are everywhere and they keep appearing from more and more keep appearing, so that everything is covered in frogs. I think, does it talk about them being on their heads? Something like that. It's just
everywhere.
A crazy phrase. They're everywhere. And the magicians, what do the magicians do? They replicate it, which doesn't help. Because now there's more frogs. And I think at that point, I don't think we see the magicians again. I don't think they do anything after that. Because what they need is for the magicians to make them disappear, not appear, not more appear. So although they can do something to replicate whatever God has done at this point, it's not a helpful thing that they do. And you can imagine the Pharaoh saying, I want rid of the frogs, I don't want more frogs. So it's no help. But still, it's not having an effect on Pharaoh. He hardens his heart. He's not going to let the people go. Then the gnats come, and like I say, we had a few little, Molly will be annoyed that I'm saying anything if I ever release this recording, but we had some fleas last year made their way into our bed somewhere, and we couldn't find them, and we vacuumed, and we put spray on it, and we had the animals medicined, and still we struggled to get rid of them for a while. But imagine if you had these gnats everywhere, and they're appearing, it's like dust, or all the dust everywhere, it says, becomes gnats. And you know how, I mean, if you wipe a thing that hasn't been dusted for a while, it's going to be dusty nowadays. But if you imagine living in Egypt thousands of years ago, we're talking about dust everywhere, lots of dust everywhere. Nobody's got a Dyson, and so the dust turns into these little bugs, and everywhere you go in Egypt, the place is covered in these horrid beasts. And the people say, this is God. They're starting to realize and be convinced now. These are not Christian people, not the Israelites. They don't really believe in the God of creation, the God of heaven and earth. They have their own gods. But and they see the Pharaoh as a god. But they start to see the Pharaoh's not in charge here. The Pharaoh's helpless here. This is the Israelite God. We're going to have to let these people go. But the Pharaoh's response is to harden his heart and say, no, we're not letting the people go. So we've had blood, frogs, and gnats, the first 3 plagues. And this one, the magicians couldn't replicate. But why would you want to? It would have been not a good thing if they had. Then we move on to the next 3. So we have the flies. Now, flies fly. Was that what we said the difference was between these?
Gnats fly.
The gnats, do the gnats fly as well?
Gnats fly and lice jump.
And lice jump. I've got flies here. Why have I got flies? Is it gnats or?
No, that was the third, gnats and lice. The third.
I think it must be Christopher Wright that calls them flies, because he does his own translations. So it's anyway. So the different thing that happens with this plague is that God says, for the first time, Goshen won't have these flies. Only Egypt's going to have this. Only Egypt's going to be plagued by the flies. And the message then, which they already seem to be getting, is that this is the God of Israel who's in control. The God of the Hebrews is in charge. There's no other fathomable reason why the land of Goshen wouldn't have a problem when the land of Egypt, which Goshen is part of, gets covered in flies. And this is when the Pharaoh then says, okay, you can go and sacrifice to God, but don't go far away. Do it here and pray for me, he even says. It's this revelation that there is something that Pharaoh can't control going on here. And his magicians, again, aren't able anymore to replicate these things. So that would make sense that the Pharaoh's starting to be concerned that this is something beyond his power and that the God of the Hebrews is working against him. And remember, for 400 years they've been or not for 400 years, but for a long time now, a generation, they've enslaved the Hebrews. 400 years since God has really been present with Joseph and Jacob. It's been like the time between the 2 testaments. There's this kind of time of silence. But this is now God starting to speak, and even for the Egyptians, this nation that's been living with them, and again we've got political lessons to learn about asylum and what racism is when it comes to comparing Israel to modern day asylees, because our whole political system is based on Christian principles, at least. And Israel, we're told, when you have strangers come to your midst looking for help, then you have to set up a system so that you can look after these people. Even a murderer coming to a certain city should be given asylum from those who are coming to get him. And I think we've lost that. We don't understand these days why a foreigner should be allowed to come to our country and look for help. Why are we expected to help him? Now, I think when we've got millions of people trying to get in, and we don't know if they're genuine asylees or not. We need to figure out a way of figuring that out, because we need to be taking people in and offering asylum to people who need it. But we seem to have lost our way. We want to throw everybody on a plane and send them back again. Well, where are you sending them back to? Do you know where you're sending them back to? Or do we want to send them off to another country that we've made a deal with, which is a strange circumstance to be in as well. And then America seems to have the same problem, but it's different. But because we're all on Twitter together, we imagine the problem's the same, and we end up with racist attitudes towards anyone with a different skin colour. And it's a problem. That's a real issue that we need to deal with. And I don't know how I got onto it from here, except that Goshen had been given to Israel, but they didn't, assimilate, which is what Reform cries out about. They're not assimilating. There was no, if Israel was told, remember what it was like in Egypt, when you were allowed to stay in Egypt, when you were asylees, when you were looking for food, then they let you stay in their land. But they didn't insist that the Jews become Egyptians. They allowed them to stay in their own land and to be the Jews. And the bad thing that happened was the Pharaoh turned against them after a few generations. The Pharaoh said, these people might rise up against us. Just like you'll see on Twitter just now, there's a Muslim guy being appointed to, what's the English Education Inspectorate?
HMIE.
They've got another name, don't they?
Ofsted.
Ofsted. So he's been appointed interim head of Ofsted, and he's a Muslim. And the London Mayor's a Muslim. The Muslims are taking over. And that's the messaging we get from silly people that don't know that there are, 27, I think, white, mostly male mayors in England, one Muslim, maybe two, but the Muslims are taking over as the messaging they put out on Twitter to scare everybody. Anyway, I'm getting too political, Sylvia would tell me. So, the God of the Hebrews is here, that's the point. Pharaoh is recognising now that's what I was saying. So he had said they're going to turn against us, they're going to take over Egypt, so we better make them into slaves, second-rate citizens, and then we'll treat our second-rate citizens, we'll use them for our good, we'll make them slaves, and we'll make them build pyramids, maybe. Who knows?
Bricks.
They were making bricks anyway. Whether they were made for the pyramids, we're not sure. So he turned against them, and God sees that as an evil thing. They start to groan under that pressure, and now God's come to save them from the evil Pharaoh. So they're to go back to Israel and remember what it was like for you as a stranger in Egypt, and that's how you're to treat your strangers when they come to Israel, to the Promised Land. You're to have ways and means of taking care of folks that come seeking genuine asylum. So, the land of Goshen, no problems. The land of Egypt, full of flies. Please take it away, says the Pharaoh to Moses. He calls Moses this time. Pray for me and take away these flies. So Pharaoh tells him, oh, and you can sacrifice in Egypt. Moses says, it'll be an abomination for the Egyptians if we do our sacrifices here. The people of Egypt will hate what we're doing. So we want to go out to the wilderness to do it. But he still goes and prays for Pharaoh and prays for the flies to go, and the flies go, and Pharaoh says, no, not going to let them go. Second plague in this second round is the plague on the livestock. God now comes to bring a plague of judgment against the animals of Egypt, and whatever our views are, in the wrong testament. I was trying to find a verse there. We're in well, I don't know. There's a text that talks about animals' spirits. And it says that animal spirits return to the ground from whence it came. But Molly's convinced that our pets are going to be in heaven. Now Molly's got lots of ideas that I think are a little airy-fairy, but you know, for it seems almost pointless, I guess, for us to have relationships like we do with our pets and these kind of things, if it's all over, and for heaven to be full of joy and so on. Maybe there's no harm in thinking that our pets will be in heaven, and lots of theologians have thought that over the ages and argued that, because there's so much value in our relationships with pets, especially the animals that we domesticate. That anyway, but this is the difference here is not simply about animals now being affected or bigger animals. It's the value that people would place on livestock that's now being taken away. They're being hit in the wallet now, these Egyptians. And for the common man or for the farmer, this is going to be a problem for Pharaoh, because the people that look to him for leadership are now going to be more than ever. It was a nuisance to have flies flying around. It was a pest to have the gnats, a pestilence even, to have the gnats around. But for these guys to lose their animal stock is going to be a loss of livelihood. They're going to lose their year's wages if their animals are hurt and die. And we find at the end of the chapter that the people of Israel, they want to leave, and they want to leave with their livestock. So their livestock in Goshen aren't affected. But there's a plague hits the livestock the livestock of Egypt. They're diseased and they're dying. The hand of the Lord will be on your cattle in the fields, on the horses, on the donkeys, on the camels, on the oxen, and on the sheep. A very severe pestilence. And so Moses warns Pharaoh beforehand, and again we've seen some of the plagues appear quickly, and it's like there's no warning. But this one, there was very much a warning. Let the people go and worship God, or you're going to end up with your livestock being lost. And the Lord appointed a set time, saying, tomorrow the Lord will do this thing in the land. So Egypt's got today to make a decision. Are you going to let the people go? But they didn't let the people go. And so God, true to his word, brings a pestilence on the livestock of Egypt, and it says all the livestock of Egypt died, but of the livestock of the children of Israel not one died. And that's one of the smallest sections here that we read when we read round in a circle, but it's one of the most powerful when you imagine that the devastation that would have brought on people who were dependent on livestock for everything. They didn't have a grocery store, a supermarket. They had their cow, and now their cow's dead. And Pharaoh's made the wrong decision. And you can see that the people are starting to turn against, or going to have to turn against, the judgment of Pharaoh. And then we have another plague, the plague of boils. And Moses is told to take, he and Aaron were to take handfuls of ashes from a furnace and scatter it in the heavens in the sight of Pharaoh. So you see the drama that's now being employed go in front of Pharaoh so he can see you. Take these handfuls of ashes, throw them in the air, and tell them wherever these ashes land, the wind's going to carry them, and wherever these land, people are going to break out in sores and boils. Man and beast. Now, there's a wee clue that, again, God seems to hold back. Not every animal is dead, because man and beast is still mentioned in the next plague, and so there are still beasts who are able to, or who have survived. But this plague of boils doesn't just affect the animals. This now affects man. So the people that are around Pharaoh, and Pharaoh himself presumably, read verse 11, the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, for the boils were on the magicians and all the Egyptians. So now their person is being affected. Their bodies are being affected. They're coming out in these sores and boils, and they can't even come now to face Moses, to argue with him. Never mind replicate whatever he was going to do. Now, it's very important, I think, at this point that we say that the fact that bad things are happening shouldn't always be read as that the people are being bad. Because bad things happen to good people. And the same Hebrew word that's used, well, no, I should say, there are no good people. There are only bad people. Jesus is the only good one. But you can't read, therefore, people are getting boils or people are under a plague as meaning those people are worse than anybody else. And the key here is the word for boils is the same word that's used for Job later in the Old Testament, or earlier in the Old Testament. We think Job could have been a contemporary of Abraham, because the Bible's not in chronological order, so that story's later, but it could have been from the time of Abraham. And so Job is a man who's got a personal relationship with God, and he's not done anything wrong, and they're looking at the whole world, and God sees Job as this righteous man. He loves God, he serves God, but the devil comes along and says, yes, but that's because his life's good, and if we made his life harder, maybe he would curse you. And so God says, on you go then. And poor Job suffers. He loses everything. He loses his farm, he loses his wife, he loses his kids, loses everything. His money, it's all gone. And yet he says, though he slay me, yet, what's the phrase? Yet will I trust him.
Yeah.
Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And he has this positive attitude to God. But all his friends come and say, you must have done something wrong. That's why this is wrong with you. That's why you've lost this or lost that. You must have done something wrong. And Job's like, honestly, I can't think of what I've done that would cause me all this pain. And the lesson for us is that pain isn't correlated to your goodness or your sin. Bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people. The rain pours on the just and the unjust, and the sun shines on the just and the unjust. So, that's true. But at the same time, we can say that here God particularly tells us that the grumbling of his people Israel has been heard, and because of his covenant with Israel and his love for Israel, he's going to do what it takes to get them out of Egypt. And then that correlates with these 10 plagues which come on Egypt that aren't simply natural disasters. They're directed at getting the Pharaoh to let the people go. And so God, all the way through here in these 3 lots of plagues, is preparing the people of Egypt to let Israel away. And maybe if the Pharaoh had let the people of Israel go at the beginning, they might not have let them go in the end, because the people would have turned against the Pharaoh. They might have pursued them into the wilderness, and Israel wouldn't even know they were coming. But the way it all works out, there's a way opened, a way made for God to free his people in his providence. So, finally, hail, locusts, and darkness. So you may know, God says, that there is none like me. Now, in Montana, we used to get hailstorms, and the hailstorms would leave dents in your cars. They were heavy, big, heavy, I don't know what they were, stones falling from the sky, which I don't think we really get here. And people's roofs would be damaged. There was felt tiles, that what did they call them again? Shingles, yeah, that they would have on the roof that were meant to last maybe 20 years, be replaced. You can see that I worked at Lowe's selling to the tradesmen. So we would say 20 years is what you should expect out of your roof, and then you should come and buy more and redo it. But the hail could damage your roof, and it would certainly damage the panels on cars if it was heavy enough. And that's the kind of hail I think we read of here. Well, even more so. They'd never seen hail like this in Egypt. And so there was a warning given that this hail was going to come, and the Lord told Moses to say to Pharaoh to let my people go, because I will send all my plagues to your very heart. He's going to reach the heart of Pharaoh to get his way. And you will know there is none like me in all the earth. Now, who can control the weather? The magicians couldn't. The God of heaven can. And the God of heaven is going to bring a cloud over Egypt. And only over Egypt, not over Goshen. And he's going to strike the people with this plague of hail. So there was hail and fire mingled with the hail. Now, lightning is probably what it means by that. So very heavy, there was none like it in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. And the hail struck throughout the whole land of Egypt, all that was in the field, both man and beast. Again, there's more beasts around. And the hail struck every herb of the field and broke every tree of the field. And that's after warning Moses warning Pharaoh that this was coming. Now I think there's also reference here to when the people were given a warning, they went inside. I'm not seeing the text. But the gospel, it's the same as the gospel warning. We preach the gospel, and our gospel preaching is that there's blessing and there's cursing. There's good news and there's bad news. There's salvation for sinners who don't deserve salvation. But there's also justice for those who don't seek salvation, for those who don't come to Christ. God is coming in judgment. God will do what is right and good. And we don't get away with sin. You either get it forgiven or you pay for your sin. And so there's this dark side to the gospel. But how people respond is up to them. And Moses goes to Pharaoh and the word gets out. God is sending this crazy hail, such as there was never seen. And there's a warning. And you either prepare or you don't. And the people that believe it, they get inside. Batten the hatches. It's like that storm that we had a few weeks ago.
Red warning.
Some people are walking along with their dogs along the front, the seafront there, and you're like, we've been told there's a danger of death if we go outside. So we batten the hatches and stay in. But some people didn't. They went out and about, so people were killed by this hail. And some of the animals were killed by this hail. Now, not every storm is a plague, but this is showing that God was in control. God's hand was over it. And only in the land of Goshen, there was no hail. You know, when you look out and you see clouds over there, they were seeing no clouds over there, actually. The clouds are here. Look at Goshen. There's not a cloud inside. Blue sky over Goshen. God's protecting his people, and God is very definitely identifying himself here. And Pharaoh says they can go. But then Pharaoh hardens his heart and decides once it's gone, once everything's rosy again, I'm not interested in doing what God says. Penultimately, Richard.
Yes.
Trees are going to be killed now by locusts. Everything is already, all the vegetation, you'd think there was nothing left. But there's a plague of locusts coming, and every bit of vegetation that's left, the stuff that's the second, well, you get your earlies when it comes to potatoes, and then you get your main crop. That's what we'll call it. So the earlies are destroyed already by the hail. Main crop now, locusts are coming, and all the trees that are left are going to be killed. And there's a warning again. And Pharaoh tries this. How about the men can go? We'll do it on my terms. Even though God's done all these things already, I still want it to look like I'm in charge. Politician. So it's like Keir Starmer. No, I better not say that. So I don't know what he's talking about with Russia and Ukraine, and I don't know why he thinks he's in charge of it all. But I think he's trying to talk big, and that's what Pharaoh's doing. He's not really in control, but he wants to sound like he's in control. Okay, I'll let you go, but only the men. The women and the children have to stay, because then I know you're coming back, because his fear is that they're not going to come back. And maybe that's wise, because turns out they don't come back. But he's doing everything he can to make it look like he's still in charge. He's still the Pharaoh. He's still going to get his way in the end. So let's try this. I'll let the men go, but not the women and not the animals. But God, what I've written here is, but God is a covenant God. God deals with families. That's why we baptize kids. Because all through the Old Testament, God deals with generations, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And their generation, when we talk about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we include Sarah, we include Rebecca, we include Rachel, and all their kids to come. And that's the kids that we've got here. God is still dealing with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their children. And in the New Testament, we constantly read about household baptism. We read about people being baptized and their children. And so we believe that God still works like that. He works with a generation and their people. And if you're a Christian and you're bringing up kids, you're either going to bring them up as unbelievers or believers. And surely Christians will bring up their kids as believers. And if they're believers, then they're part of the covenant. The family belongs to God. And so here, when Pharaoh says, only the men can go. Well, the covenant God isn't interested in only the men. The covenant God is interested in the women and the children, and he's going to take them all to the promised land. And then the plague of locusts come, and we're told never before was there such a plague, and never again will there be such a plague. It's like the flood. You remember the promise of the flood? There'll be a rainbow in the sky, and the rainbow in the sky is there as a promise to say it'll never happen again. The world will not be flooded in judgment again. Now, why is that? Well, scientifically, if we're trying to explain it, well, some people think it never rained before the flood. It was a mist. The Garden of Eden, we're told that there was a mist that watered the plants, and that up till the time of the flood, it was the world would mist. But something happened. God changed things, because when the flood happened, there were the clouds in the sky that brought down rain, but there was also the land broke up, and rain and water was spewing out from inside the earth. And so I don't know that we need to have any kind of scientific explanation, or we just believe it as a principle, I guess. But the idea is that God did something unique at the flood, and he was never going to do it again. And that's how impressive this locust infestation is. Nobody had ever seen anything like this, and nobody ever will again, because it was a one-off. The locusts came, they ate all the vegetation. And then finally, darkness. Now, we're all a bit scared of the dark, I think, and Jack definitely gets quite scared. He opens the door and he's like, will you come with me? And you know you have to. So there's no warning to Pharaoh this time. We've already been told that he said to Moses that he didn't want to see his face anymore. And Moses says, you won't see my face anymore. And God is going to bring this darkness, and nobody for 3 days could even see each other. Now, I'm not sure what's going on with fire and candles and things like that, or whatever kind of torches they would have had. But it seems to me, reading it, as though this is outer darkness, and they couldn't even do things like that. I mean, if all of a sudden the place became pitch black right now, where would we find a torch? So it seems as though this suddenly darkness appeared over Egypt, and there was this complete blackness. And the Bible talks about hell as outer darkness. How do you have a lake of fire and outer darkness? I think we can say these aren't literal, but the ideas associated with them are there. The idea of fear when outer darkness appears. The idea of not knowing what's really going on, I think is what, these are the things we should take from these terms. But for 3 days, creation was undone. Let there be light is the first command when God creates the world. But he takes away the light in Egypt. And it's a fearful thing. And the Pharaoh suggests, leave your flocks and your herds. But Moses says, no, we need, again he's trying to get it on his own terms. Still, after 9 plagues, we need them for sacrifices, and that's that. So Pharaoh's not getting his way. But I think as well, before we leave this, or before we conclude, that this darkness, this outer darkness, should also take us to the cross. Because we began with Jesus and the first miracle, the blood, and the water and the blood, and the water and the wine. But then we get to this 9th plague, which is the last of the groups of 3. And I think we need to remember Jesus dying on the cross, paying for the sins of his people, and there was darkness came over the earth for 6 hours. So from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. there was darkness. And the darkness is there at the moment when God is pouring out his wrath, his judgment on Jesus at the cross. Hell is what we see at the cross in that darkness. And that's why hell is described as outer darkness, and is the first thing we should think of when we read these people lived for 3 days with no light. So Jesus suffers hell on the cross as the Lamb of God. And again, the fact that the animal sacrifices are mixed up in this plague, mentioned in this plague, the Lamb of God is taking away the sin of the world. And there's no more opportunity for Pharaoh after this. This is it. This is the last chance for the Pharaoh. This is the last plague that's not going to destroy this country and these people. And Pharaoh refuses to let the people go, even though he's been offered again and again the chance to do God's will. We'll leave it there. Good suspense for the last plague, plague number 10.